polygons are all different to black-tailed prairie dogs in that they have white tails, so it makes it easier to tell that they are not the black-tailed prairie dog. But each is a different species with different ecology. There's the white-tailed prairie dog in the orange, the Gunnison's prairie dog in the blue, and the Utah prairie dog in the purple. And finally, there's a species called the Mexican prairie dog down south of the border. The Utah prairie dog is found in several counties of southern Utah, shown on the map at right. And Utah has 3 of the species of prairie dogs with white tails, but it's the only state that has Utah prairie dogs. In southern Utah, they're most often confused with ground squirrels because the juvenile Utah prairie dog is about the same size as an adult ground squirrel. If we want to compare the Utah prairie dog to the ground squirrel, the Utah prairie dog is on the left, and you can see that it has more of a brownish fur, and it has a sort of a black eyebrow over its eyes, whereas the ground squirrel sort of has a grayish, tawny fur and no eye stripe. They have small litters of about 3 or 4 per year. They're about a foot tall as adults. They grow to be about 1 to 3 pounds and living 3 to 4 years. They have a high level of mortality. That's just part of their biology. And throughout the course of the year, only about 25% will actually live. They eat grass and forbs in the summer months. They hibernate during the winter, although if it's nice and dry and temperate in the winter, then they will come out. The goal is to get fat enough to hibernate through those lean winter months. But it's not like the hibernation of a grizzly bear. Utah prairie dogs will actually get up and forage if they get hungry and if it's not that cold. During the summer, Utah prairie dogs also avoid heat. They're active in the morning, and then they go underground when it gets too hot for them, and then come on out for an evening snack before it gets dark. They're social animals, just like the other prairie dog species. Their populations can be broken down into 3 basic elements: coteries, wards, and towns, although each of these isn't always present. A coterie is a clustering of a male and a few females, and in this example there are 13 coteries, so it would be a male, a few females, and their juvenile offspring. A ward is where there are a cluster of coteries that have a visual or geographic obstruction that excludes everyday interchange from other wards, but they can still interact. And then the town is the whole grouping. So in this example, there are 13 coteries, there are 2 wards, and there's 65 individuals. And this is a diagram of what I would consider a really healthy Utah prairie dog town. Usually, if we have a prairie dog town with 20 prairie dogs, we feel like we're doing pretty good. And within these towns, the females are in charge. Their life centers around the eldest female in the coterie, and they take turns babysitting the offspring and getting food. So why are they threatened? What is the big deal with Utah prairie dogs? What makes them different than other white-tailed prairie dogs or even the black-tailed prairie dog? Well, the difference is that they have smaller reproduction compared to other squirrels and other ground squirrels, with a high mortality of juveniles. And this results in low populations that take a long time to grow, and these populations can become fragmented if there's housing developments or highways or fires that bisect their habitat. And complicating this issue is that humans have a long history of conflict with the prairie dogs. Even before we realized that they were different species than the black-tailed prairie dogs, there's actually a federal program designed to remove prairie dogs from the area so that we could have our agricultural productions without competition from prairie dogs. And now we have a federal program designed to do completely the opposite. So here's some of the reasons for the conflicts. For one, they compete with human activities. They like the same loose soil as our farmers do, and that's really limited in southern Utah. So it's usually this easily farmable land, and we have to compete with other species for that. Really high populations can compete with cattle for forage on the range. There are very few places in southern Utah where we have populations that high, but they do exist. Alfalfa tastes good, so sometimes they just set up their coteries and their wards on the corner pivots of an alfalfa plot because alfalfa is yummy and it's highly nutritious. And then finally they dig and they make holes, and those holes cause problems. This is a picture of the Cedar City golf course, and as you can see, it might be kind of difficult to golf when you've got holes all over the fairway. But those same reasons that we have conflict are the same reasons that the Utah Prairie Dogs need some sort of protection. The other problem is that we have a predominant health worry in plague. So Utah Prairie Dogs do contract plague, and in some cases they can transmit it, although it's not very common. The plague actually kills prairie dogs quite quickly, and it can actually take out a colony within a day or two. So someone would have to interact with the prairie dog during an active outbreak in order to get plague from the prairie dogs. The actual problem is that fleas exist in the area, and a human could pick up a flea that's actually carrying the plague virus, whether or not they interact with the Utah Prairie Dog themselves. Plague is actually more predominant in New Mexico and Arizona. We have very low incidence of plague in Utah, and thus very low instances of conflict in plague with the Utah Prairie Dog and humans. But there are some reasons why this is actually a really good species to have around if you can find a way to live with them. They're very socially responsible. There's a lot of grooming and face touching. They have shared babysitting, and it's mama's house. The mom takes care of the household, and very similar to our own social structure. Probably the most important reason to appreciate Utah Prairie Dogs is that they're good for the natural environment. They create their environment, which is then used by others. So they are actually a keystone species. In areas where there are prairie dogs, the forage has higher nutrition. Prairie dogs keep out shrubs and allow more grasses to grow. Unlike the black-tailed prairie dogs, Utah prairie dogs don't live in high densities, so they don't wear out the habitat. The habitat doesn't look worse because the Utah prairie dogs are there. The way that prairie dogs graze and dig also increases water concentration and contributes to the overall plant and animal diversity in and around the colonies. And then, of course, they bring their own fertilizer. About 160 animal species have been recorded using Utah Prairie Dog burrows, eating the prairie dogs, or otherwise living in the habitat that prairie dogs create. Some examples are pocket mice, kangaroo rats, burrowing owls, toads, snakes, 13-line ground squirrels, Townsend's ground squirrels, beetles, other insects, cottontail rabbits. So a whole ecosystem is created when you have a Utah Prairie Dog colony or coterie. Utah Prairie Dogs are food for eagles, badgers, foxes, hawks, coyotes, a suite of birds and mammals, and reptiles. So they actually create a food web just by being there. So not only are they creating a habitat, they're creating a community of animal species in the area. And in particular, they help maintain habitat for what we call landscape species, those species that need huge expanses of grasslands and interspersed sagebrush and grasses in the environment, such as sage sparrows and sage thrashers, pronghorn, and sage grouse, which is another sensitive species in Utah. And finally, another interesting fact about the Utah prairie dogs is that they are great communicators. Some research in the last 25 years has determined that other than humans, they may have the most complex language in the mammal kingdom. They learn to talk just like we do, and if the juveniles are separated from their parents before they learn that vocabulary, the juveniles actually don't thrive because they don't understand the communication of other Utah prairie dogs. So it's important that we keep the adults and the juveniles together long enough for the juveniles to learn their language and be able to understand the tweets and shrills that prairie dogs have when they're warning about predators. And with that, I hope that you guys got a little bit of an overview on the biology of Utah prairie dogs, the conflicts that we have in southern Utah with prairie dogs, and the benefits that we have from existing with Utah prairie dogs.